The rain had been falling steadily since early evening, turning the streets of downtown Chicago into shimmering mirrors that reflected neon signs and passing headlights in wobbly streaks. Inside the restaurant, Laurent's, a place where the wine list cost more than most people's weekly groceries, the air smelled of rosemary, seared duck, and money. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Low murmurs of conversation floated above the gentle hum of a grand piano tucked in the corner, its notes curling through the room like smoke. Behind the scenes, in the narrow corridor that connected the kitchen to the dining floor, Elira Voss adjusted the black apron tied around her waist and took a slow breath. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet steadiness that made her seem older. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, not a strand out of place, and her eyes, deep brown, flecked with gold, held a kind of tired alertness, like someone who'd learned to stay awake even while sleeping. She'd been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon, and her shift wouldn't end until midnight. But she didn't complain. Complaining didn't pay the bills, and the bills were piling up. Her younger brother, Matteo, was still recovering from the motorcycle accident 3 months ago, a collision with a delivery van that left him with a shattered femur, 2 broken ribs, and a long road of physical therapy ahead. Their mother had passed 2 years earlier, and since then Elira had become both sister and guardian. She'd sold her car, downsized their apartment, and taken on extra shifts wherever she could. Laurent's paid well for a waitstaff position, but well in this context still meant counting every dollar, skipping meals when tips were light, and re-wearing uniforms until the seams frayed. What no one at Laurent's knew, what almost no one in her current life knew, was that Elira had once sat in practice rooms at Juilliard, her fingers flying over ivory keys with a precision that made professors lean forward in their chairs. She'd played Chopin with a tenderness that bordered on haunting, and Beethoven with a fire that startled even seasoned critics. But dreams, she'd learned, were expensive. When her mother got sick, tuition became impossible. She'd left the conservatory in her 2nd year, packed her few belongings, and returned home to care for her family. The piano she'd inherited from her grandmother, a beautiful old Steinway, was sold to cover hospital co-pays. She hadn't touched a real piano since. Now she moved through the dining room with practiced grace, balancing a tray of seared scallops and duck confit as if it weighed nothing. Her smile was polite but not warm, just enough to be professional, not enough to invite familiarity. She knew the type of people who dined here: venture capitalists, real estate moguls, heirs to fortunes they'd never worked for. They spoke in code: liquidity events, asset diversification, disruptive innovation, and treated service staff like furniture, necessary but invisible. Tonight, one table stood out. It was a private reservation in the far corner, near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the rain-slicked street. 5 men, all in tailored suits, laughing a little too loudly over bottles of Bordeaux that cost more than Elira made in a week. At the head of the table sat a man with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper gaze. His name was Julian Croft, though Elira didn't know that yet. She'd seen his type before. Confident to the point of arrogance, used to getting whatever he wanted with a snap of his fingers. He wore a watch that probably cost more than her rent, and he kept glancing around the room like he was assessing its worth rather than enjoying the meal. Elira approached the table with a fresh carafe of water. She moved quietly as she always did, not wanting to interrupt. But as she leaned in to refill his glass, her elbow brushed the edge of a bread plate. A single drop of water slipped from the carafe and landed on the white linen tablecloth, just beside his plate. It was barely noticeable. A tiny dark spot, no bigger than a dime. But Julian noticed. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Clumsy," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Do they not train you people to hold a glass properly?" The laughter at the table died instantly. One of the men shifted in his seat. Another stared into his wine. Elira froze. Her cheeks warmed, but she didn't flinch. She'd been insulted before, by customers, by landlords, by life itself. She'd learned to let the words slide off like rain off a window pane. "I'm sorry, sir," she said evenly, her voice calm. "Let me get a fresh cloth." She turned to go, but he wasn't done. "Wait," he said, his tone dripping with mock concern. "Are you sure you're cut out for this? Places like Laurent's demand precision, not whatever that was." A few of his companions chuckled nervously, unsure whether to side with him or stay silent. Elira turned back slowly. She met his eyes. Not with anger, but with a quiet intensity that made him pause for half a second. "I'll be more careful," she said simply. Then she walked away, her spine straight, her step steady. In the staff hallway, she pressed her forehead against the cool tile wall for just a moment. Not to cry, she hadn't cried in months, but to breathe. To remind herself why she was here. Mateo's next therapy session was tomorrow. The copay was $85. She needed this job. She needed these tips. She could swallow pride. She'd swallowed worse. Back in the dining room, the piano player, a retired music teacher named Mr. Delaney, was wrapping up his set. He gave Illyra a small nod as he passed. "Rough crowd tonight," he murmured. "Always is," she replied with a faint smile. Mr. Delaney had been playing at Laurent's for 10 years. He knew Illyra's story, or at least parts of it. Once, during a slow Tuesday night, she'd mentioned she used to play. He'd raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Some silences, he understood, were meant to be respected. At 9:45 p.m., disaster struck. Mr. Delaney's phone rang in the staff break room. His wife was in the hospital. Sudden dizziness, high blood pressure. He had to leave immediately. The manager, a harried man named Greg, paced the hallway like a caged animal. "We can't have dead air during dessert hour," he muttered. "Croft's table is staying late. They're closing a deal. We need ambiance." He scanned the room desperately. Then his eyes landed on Illyra. "You said you used to play," he said, voice low but urgent. "Is that still true?" Illyra's stomach dropped. "That was a long time ago, Greg. I haven't touched a piano in years." "But you could?" he pressed. "Just for an hour? Fill in until closing?" She looked toward the piano. It was a Yamaha Grand, polished to a high shine, waiting silently in the corner like a sleeping animal. Her fingers twitched at her sides. "I don't know," she started. "Please, Illyra, I'll pay you double, triple if you want. But we need someone. Now." She thought of Mateo, of the stack of bills on her kitchen counter, of the way Julian had looked at her like she was less than human. And then she thought of the music, the way it used to live inside her, like a second heartbeat. She nodded. "Okay, but just for tonight." Greg exhaled in relief. "Thank you, seriously." 10 minutes later, Illyra stood by the piano, smoothing her uniform. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she clenched them into fists and released them over and over until they steadied. The dining room had quieted. Dessert plates were being cleared. Julian's table was still there, sipping espresso and laughing about something Illyra didn't care to hear. She sat at the bench. The leather was cool beneath her. She adjusted it, just as she'd been taught years ago. Then she placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she began. She didn't choose something safe or simple. She didn't play a pop song or a jazz standard. She went straight for Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu, a piece she'd practiced for months at Juilliard, one that demanded speed, control, and emotional depth. The opening notes were soft, almost hesitant, like footsteps in an empty hallway. Then they built, faster, fiercer, until her fingers were flying across the keys, weaving a tapestry of sound that filled every corner of the room. Conversations stopped. Glasses froze halfway to lips, even the kitchen. Staff peeked out from behind the swinging doors. Julian's smirk vanished. He sat very still, his espresso forgotten. The music wasn't just skill, it was feeling. It carried longing, defiance, sorrow, and strength all at once. It was the sound of someone who'd lost everything but refused to be broken. By the time she reached the final cascading arpeggio, the entire restaurant was silent. Not the polite silence of waiting, but the deep, breathless silence of awe. When the last note faded, there was a beat of stillness, then applause. Not scattered clapping, but a wave of it rising from every table. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a napkin. An older man stood and gave a small bow. Even the dishwasher, peeking through the kitchen door, grinned and clapped. Illyra didn't stand. She kept her hands on the keys, her head slightly bowed. Her heart pounded not from nerves, but from something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Recognition, not for her service, not for her uniform, but for her. For the part of her she'd buried. Julian didn't clap. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. But for the first time that night he looked unsettled. As the applause died down, Illyra rose and walked back toward the staff hallway. Her legs felt unsteady, like she'd just stepped off a boat. But inside something had shifted. She didn't know it yet, but that single performance would change everything. For now, though, she had dishes to clear and a shift to finish. She tied her apron back on, smoothed her hair, and stepped into the dining room once more. Still a waitress. Still invisible to most, but not to herself. And not, she would soon learn, to the world. The night ended with rain still tapping against the windows, but inside Laurent's the air felt different, lighter, charged with something unspoken. Elira finished her shift in a daze, stacking chairs and wiping down tables with hands that still tingled from the piano keys. She kept expecting someone to stop her, to say it had all been a mistake, that she wasn't supposed to play, that she'd overstepped, but no one did. Instead, servers she barely knew gave her quiet nods. The bartender slipped her an extra tip with a wink. Even Greg, the manager, paused by the coat rack and said, "You okay? Not about the spill, not about the job, but about her." She just nodded, pulled her thin jacket tight, and stepped out into the damp Chicago night. She walked the 20 blocks home, heels clicking against wet pavement, her mind replaying every note, every silence, every face in the crowd. She hadn't played like that in years, not since before her mother got sick, not since she'd boxed up her sheet music and sold her metronome along with everything else that reminded her of a life she couldn't afford anymore. And yet her fingers remembered. Her body remembered. It was like riding a bike you hadn't touched in a decade. Wobbly at first, then suddenly, instinctively, whole again. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building with flickering hallway lights and a front door that never quite latched. Inside, the space was small but clean. 2 rooms, a kitchenette, and a window that overlooked a fire escape and a sliver of the city skyline. Matteo was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a faded quilt, his leg propped on a stack of pillows. A half-finished puzzle sat on the coffee table. Mountains and pine trees, something peaceful. She tiptoed past him, changed into sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands in the dim light. They looked the same, slightly rough from dishwater and sanitizer. Nails kept short and plain, but they didn't feel the same. They felt alive. The next morning, Matteo was awake by 8, hobbling to the kitchen on crutches. "You're up early," he said, eyeing her as she poured coffee. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. He grinned. "Still thinking about last night?" She hadn't told him what happened. She'd planned to, but the words got stuck somewhere between her throat and her lips. Now she just nodded. "Good," he said, stirring sugar into his tea. "About time you remembered who you are." She looked at him, surprised. "You knew? I've seen you hum along to classical radio when you think I'm not listening," he said with a shrug. "And once, when I was sick, you played that old keyboard app on your phone for an hour. You thought I was asleep. I wasn't," she smiled faintly. "I didn't think anyone noticed." "People notice more than you think," he said, "especially when you're trying not to be seen." Later that day, while folding laundry, her phone buzzed with a notification. A co-worker had sent her a link. "Waitress stuns Chicago elite with impromptu piano performance." She clicked it, heart thudding. The video was shaky, filmed from a phone near the bar, but it was unmistakably her. There she was, in her black uniform, sitting at the piano, head slightly bowed. Then the music began. Comments poured in. "Who is she?" This gave me chills. "Why is she waiting tables?" This is why you never judge someone by their job. Within hours, the clip had thousands of views. By evening, it hit 50,000. News outlets started calling. A local morning show wanted her on air. A community arts center asked if she'd consider a guest performance. Someone claiming to be a talent scout left 3 voicemails. Elira didn't answer any of them. She felt exposed, like she'd accidentally opened a door she'd kept locked for years. But then came the message that changed everything. It was from a woman named Dr. Lynn Tran, a piano professor at a small conservatory in the city. She wrote, "I recognized your phrasing in the Chopin. It's rare. I taught at Juilliard briefly, around the time you would have been there. If your name is Elira Voss, I remember you. You left too soon. If you're open to it, I'd love to talk. No pressure. Just coffee." Elira read the message 5 times. Her hands shook. She didn't reply right away. But she didn't delete it either. Meanwhile, across town, Julian Croft sat in his penthouse office staring at the same video on his laptop. He'd watched it 3 times already. The first time he'd scoffed. Surely it was edited, or she'd rehearsed it, or it wasn't even her. But the second time, he noticed the way her shoulders tensed before she began, the slight tremor in her left hand as she lifted it from the keys. This wasn't performance. This was truth. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He'd spent his life believing in hierarchy, that some people were born to lead, to own, to command, while others were meant to serve, to obey, to stay in place. It was a tidy worldview, one that justified his success and excused his sharpness. But Elira didn't fit. She'd been serving him 1 minute, then commanding the room the next, not with words but with art. And art didn't care about bank accounts or titles. He tried to dismiss it. One lucky piece, he muttered to himself. Doesn't mean anything, but the video kept playing in his head even when his screen was off. Back at Laurent's, Greg offered Elira the piano spot permanently. Just weekends, he said. Same pay as waitressing plus tips from the bar crowd. And you can keep your shifts if you want. She hesitated. Playing felt dangerous now, like stepping into a spotlight she wasn't ready for. But then she thought of Mateo's next round of therapy, the copay, the rent due in 10 days. She said yes. That Saturday night, the restaurant was packed. Word had spread. People came not just for the food, but to see her. She wore the same black uniform, but this time, she walked to the piano with her head higher. She played a mix of pieces, Debussy's Clair de Lune, a gentle rendition of Moon River, even a haunting version of a Radiohead song she'd loved in college. No one talked during her set. No one clinked glasses. They just listened. Afterward, a woman approached her, eyes glistening. My daughter wants to quit piano lessons, she said softly. She says it's boring. I showed her your video this morning. Tonight she practiced for an hour without being asked. She pressed a folded bill into Elira's hand, more than a tip. A thank you that night. Elira sat on her fire escape, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights flicker below. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She felt like she was breathing, but not everyone was celebrating. Julian, still uneasy, began digging. He called in a favor from a friend in media research. Find out everything you can about the waitress who played piano at Laurent's last Thursday. Full name, background, education, family. 2 days later, a file landed in his inbox. It wasn't scandalous. No criminal record, no shady past. Just a quiet tragedy. Mother deceased, brother injured, dropped out of Juilliard due to financial hardship. Sold personal assets, worked multiple jobs. No social media presence beyond a basic LinkedIn. No debts and collections. Just struggle. Honest, relentless, invisible struggle. He read it twice. Then he closed the file and stared out his window at the skyline. He'd expected fraud, arrogance, a scheme. Instead, he found sacrifice. It made him angry. Not at her, but at himself. Because he'd looked at her and seen only her role, not her story. He'd assumed incompetence because she served him water. And in doing so, he'd revealed his own blindness. Still, he told no one. He didn't apologize. He wasn't built for that kind of humility yet, but something had shifted. Meanwhile, Elira accepted an invitation to play at the Oakwood Community Arts Center, a modest venue in a neighborhood far from Laurent's chandeliers and wine lists. The center served kids from low-income families, offering free music, dance, and painting classes in a converted church basement. The director, a warm woman named Rosa, had seen the video and said, "We can't pay much, but we can give you a stage, and an audience that needs to hear this." Elira agreed. She chose to play for free. The day of the performance, she arrived early. Kids were running around with violins and recorders, laughing, arguing over sheet music. One little girl, no older than 7, sat alone on a folding chair, staring at a keyboard with wide eyes. "You like piano?" Elira asked gently. The girl nodded shyly. "My mom says I can't afford lessons." Elira's chest tightened. "Would you like to try something?" She sat beside the girl, guided her small hands to the keys, and showed her how to play a simple C major scale. The girl's face lit up like sunrise. Later, as Elira played for the room, parents in folding chairs, toddlers on laps, teens leaning against the wall, she saw something she hadn't seen at Laurent's. Recognition. Not awe, not curiosity, but connection. These people didn't see a spectacle. They saw possibility. After the set, Rosa handed her a thermos of tea. "You belong here," she said simply. Elira almost cried. That night she made a decision. She wouldn't chase fame. She wouldn't audition for orchestras or sign with agents. But she would play, wherever she could, for whoever would listen. especially for those who'd been told they couldn't. And then, just as she was packing up, her phone buzzed again. It was Dr. Tran. "Still up for coffee?" This time, Illyra replied, "Yes, tomorrow." She hit send, then looked out the window at the stars, faint but steady, like hope. Across the city, Julian sat at his desk, the file on Illyra still open on his screen. He didn't close it. He just stared at her Juilliard photo, young, bright-eyed, full of dreams, and wondered how many other people he'd misjudged because they didn't wear expensive watches or speak in boardroom jargon. He didn't know it yet, but he was beginning to see the world differently, and Illyra, she was beginning to remember herself. The piano hadn't just played music that night at Laurent's. It had unlocked a door, one that led not to fame or fortune, but to something far more valuable: the quiet, unshakable truth that talent doesn't vanish when life gets hard. It just waits. And sometimes all it takes is one drop of courage or one spilled drop of water to bring it back to life. The coffee shop was quiet on a Tuesday morning, the kind of place where the baristas knew regulars by name and the pastries were baked in-house before sunrise. Illyra arrived 10 minutes early, clutching her coat like armor. She hadn't been this nervous since her Juilliard audition, maybe even more so, because this time there was no script, no prepared piece, just two people in a conversation that could either heal something or reopen a wound she'd spent years stitching shut. Dr. Lynn Tran was already there, sitting by the window with a steaming mug and a stack of sheet music beside her. She looked older than Illyra remembered, silver threading through her dark hair, lines around her eyes that spoke of long rehearsals and late nights. But her gaze was just as sharp, just as kind. "You came," Dr. Tran said, standing to greet her. "I almost didn't," Illyra admitted. They sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Dr. Tran pushed a small envelope across the table. "I brought this." Illyra opened it. Inside was a single ticket. "What's this for?" "A recital next month. At the conservatory. I'd like you to play." Illyra's breath caught. I haven't performed in a proper hall in over 5 years." "I know," Dr. Tran said gently. "But music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. And last week you played with more truth than most professionals I've heard this year." Illyra looked down at the ticket, her fingers tracing the embossed logo. It felt heavy, not because of the paper but because of what it represented. A return. Not as a student, not as a prodigy, but as someone who'd walked away and found her way back through sheer will. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Dr. Tran nodded. "Good enough." They talked for over an hour, about technique, yes, but also about life. Dr. Tran shared how she'd once taken a 10-year break from teaching to care for her aging parents. "I thought I'd lost it," she said. But the music was still there, just waiting. Illyra left the cafe feeling lighter, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. That afternoon she called Rosa at the Community Arts Center and agreed to teach a weekly beginner's piano class, free of charge. "We'll find a way to cover your time," Rosa insisted, but Illyra shook her head. "Just let me do this." The first class was held the following Saturday. 6 kids showed up, ages 6 to 12, most wearing hand-me-down shoes and carrying notebooks held together with rubber bands. Illyra didn't start with scales or theory. She asked them, "What song makes you feel happy?" One boy said his grandma's lullaby. A girl named Aisha said a pop song she heard on the radio. Illyra listened, then played snippets of each on the old upright piano in the corner, adding flourishes, simplifying chords, making them playable for small hands. Their eyes lit up. By the end of the hour they were laughing, trying to mimic her hand positions, arguing over who got to press the sustain pedal next. After class, Aisha lingered. "Do you think I could ever play like you?" she asked, voice small. Illyra knelt so they were eye level. "You already are," she said. "Every time you try, you're playing like me. Because we're both learning." That night she sat at her kitchen table and wrote down a list. Piano studio. Affordable lessons. Sliding scale. No one turned away. It wasn't a business plan, just a dream scribbled in pencil. But for the first time it felt possible. Meanwhile, the video of her performance continued to spread. A local news station aired a short segment. From Waitress to Wonder, Chicago musician's second act. They interviewed Greg from Laurent's, Rosa from the Arts Center, even Mateo, who grinned and said, "She's always been magic. We just forgot to look." The attention brought opportunities and complications. A talent agency reached out offering representation. "We can get you on national TV," the agent said. "Maybe even a record deal." Elira listened politely, then declined. "I don't want to be famous," she said. "I just want to play." But not everyone understood. Some online commenters grew suspicious. "Too perfect," one wrote. "This has to be staged." Another claimed she was using her brother's injury for sympathy. The accusations stung, not because they were true, but because they reduced her struggle to a performance. She didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that some people would rather believe a lie than confront their own assumptions. Julian saw the news segment. He watched it alone in his office, the city lights glittering behind him like scattered coins. When Matteo appeared on screen, smiling despite the crutches, speaking with quiet pride, Julian felt a strange pang in his chest. He thought of his own brother, estranged for years over a business dispute neither would apologize for. He turned off the TV, but he couldn't stop thinking about Elira. He began visiting Laurent's again, not with clients, not for deals, but alone, late at night, when the crowd had thinned. He'd sit at the bar, order a whiskey neat, and listen. He never approached her, never clapped too loudly, but he was there, night after night, like a man trying to understand a language he'd never learned. One evening after her set, Elira noticed him. She didn't acknowledge him, but she saw the way he watched her hands, the way he stayed until the last note faded. It confused her. Was he waiting for her to fail? To prove it was all a fluke? She didn't know that Julian had quietly contacted the rehab center where Matteo received therapy. He didn't give his name. Just said, "There's a patient, Matteo Voss, his sister's the pianist. Make sure he gets everything he needs. I'll cover any uncovered costs." The administrator was stunned. "Sir, that could be thousands." "Do it," Julian said and hung up. Back in her apartment, Elira practiced daily now, not for an audience, but for herself. She dug out old sheet music from a box under her bed, pages yellowed at the edges. She played Chopin, yes, but also pieces she'd never dared attempt before. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, simplified for solo piano. Her fingers ached sometimes, but it was a good ache, the kind that meant she was growing. Matteo started walking without crutches. His first full step without support, he called out, "Elira, look." She ran into the living room, tears in her eyes, and hugged him so hard he laughed. "You're gonna crush my ribs again," he teased. "I don't care," she said. "You're walking, life wasn't perfect." Rent was still tight. Some days she still served tables at Laurent's between teaching and practicing. But there was a rhythm to it now, a balance between survival and soul. Then came the invitation she couldn't ignore. Dr. Tran called again. "The recital is in 2 weeks. We've reserved the main hall. It's small, but it's yours. Just you, the piano, and whoever shows up." Elira hesitated. "What if no one comes?" "Then you'll play for the walls," Dr. Tran said. "And the walls will remember." Elira said yes. She chose her program carefully. Not to impress, but to tell a story. A piece from her Juilliard days. A folk melody her mother used to hum, and a new composition of her own. Simple, raw, titled For Matteo. She practiced it every night, refining each phrase until it felt like breathing. The week before the recital, she received a surprise visitor. Rosa from the Arts Center arrived with a box. "The kids made this for you," she said. Inside was a handmade card signed by every student and a small ceramic pin shaped like a piano key. "They wanted you to wear it," Rosa said. "For luck." Elira pinned it to her jacket and didn't take it off for days. Julian heard about the recital through a mutual acquaintance, a board member at the conservatory who mentioned, "That waitress from Laurent's is playing next Friday." "Strange, isn't it?" Julian didn't answer, but he marked the date in his calendar. As the day approached, Elira felt a familiar fear creeping in, the old voice that whispered, "You don't belong here. You're not good enough." But this time she talked back. "I belong wherever I show up with honesty," she told herself. "And I'm showing up." The night before the recital, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the fire escape, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city breathe. She thought about her mother, who'd saved for years to buy her first keyboard. She thought about Matteo, who never once complained about his pain. She thought about the little girl at the Arts Center who now practiced every day on a donated keyboard. She wasn't playing for fame. She wasn't playing to prove anything to Julian Croft or anyone else. She was playing because the music had saved her, and maybe, just maybe, it could save someone else too. The next evening, she arrived at the conservatory early. The hall was intimate, wood-paneled walls, soft lighting, about 80 seats. She changed into a simple black dress, no jewelry, just the piano key pin on her lapel. Backstage, her hands trembled. But then she heard voices in the hall, familiar ones. Rosa, Mateo walking steadily on his own, Aisha and 2 other kids from her class bouncing in their seats, Dr. Tran smiling from the front row. Even Greg from Laurent's had come, standing in the back with a proud grin. And then she saw him. Julian sat alone in the very last row, near the exit, as if ready to slip away if needed. He wore a dark suit, no tie, and he didn't look at anyone, just stared at the empty stage. Elira took a deep breath. She walked out. No grand entrance. No spotlight. Just a woman and a piano. She sat, placed her hands on the keys, and began. The first notes were soft, like a memory returning. Then they grew, stronger, clearer, full of everything she'd carried for years: grief, hope, love, resilience. The audience disappeared. It was just her and the music, the way it had always been. And in the back row, Julian listened, not as a man used to judging, but as someone finally learning to hear. The applause that followed Elira's final note didn't feel like noise. It felt like warmth, like hands reaching out to hold her steady. She sat for a moment, fingers resting on the keys, eyes closed, letting the silence settle into her bones. When she finally stood, the room rose with her. Not all of it. Some people stayed seated, moved too deeply to move at all, but enough to make the small hall feel full in a way that had nothing to do with numbers. She didn't bow like a performer. She just nodded softly, as if saying thank you not to an audience, but to the music itself. Backstage, Mateo was waiting with a paper cup of water and a grin so wide it looked painful. "You were incredible," he said, handing her the cup. "Like actually incredible. Not just brother in denial incredible." She laughed, the tension in her shoulders finally loosening. "I was so nervous I forgot the second verse of For Mateo halfway through." "You didn't," he said. "I was counting every note." Rosa arrived next, eyes shining. "The kids are buzzing. Aisha said she's going to practice every day until she can play like you." She paused, then added, "You've given them something they didn't know they needed. Permission to dream." Elira swallowed. That word, dream, still felt foreign on her tongue, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Then Dr. Tran appeared, holding a single white rose. "You played like you'd never left," she said quietly. "Like the years in between were just breaths." Elira accepted the rose, its petals cool against her palm. "I almost didn't come tonight." "I know," Dr. Tran said. "But you did. And that's what matters." As the crowd thinned and people began to leave, Elira lingered near the stage, folding her sheet music, avoiding the mirror in the green room. She didn't want to see if she looked different. She just wanted to feel like herself again. That's when she saw him. Julian stood near the exit, still in his dark suit, hands in his pockets. He hadn't approached anyone, hadn't clapped loudly, hadn't even smiled. But he was still there long after most had gone. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Julian took a step forward. Elira's stomach tightened, but she didn't look away. She'd faced worse than awkward silences. He stopped a few feet from her. No smirk, no condescension. Just a man who looked tired in a way money couldn't fix. "You played that piece for your brother," he said, voice low. She nodded. "Yes. He's walking now." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Mostly, still some pain, but he's getting there." Julian looked down at his shoes. Italian leather polished to a shine but scuffed at the heel, as if he'd been pacing. "I saw the news piece," he said. "About the accident." Elira waited. She didn't offer explanations. Didn't ask why he cared. After a long pause, he said, "I looked into your past." She stiffened slightly. "Why?" "Because I didn't understand how someone who'd trained at Juilliard ended up serving me water like I was royalty," he admitted, voice rough. "I don't know what I thought. That you were hiding something, that it was a stunt. And now?" she asked. "Now I see it wasn't hiding," he said. It was surviving. The words hung between them, simple and heavy. Illyra exhaled. Surviving doesn't leave much room for pianos. No, he agreed. It doesn't. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the empty hall around them. Then Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded check. This is for Matteo's therapy, he said, holding it out. All of it. Past, present, future. No strings. Illyra didn't take it. I can't accept that. Why not? He asked, genuinely puzzled. Is it pride? No, she said. It's dignity. I appreciate the offer. But I need to earn my way, not be handed it even with good intentions. He stared at her, then slowly tucked the check back into his pocket. You're right, he said, surprising her. I keep trying to fix things with money. But some things, money can't touch. Like respect, she said gently. Like that. He agreed. He didn't apologize, not in words. But the way he held her gaze steady, unflinching, said more than 1,000 sorries ever could. I'll find another way, he said finally. To help, not as charity, as balance, she nodded. That she could understand. He turned to leave, then paused. Will you play again? Publicly, I mean. I teach now, she said. And I'll play where it matters, community centers, schools, places where kids think music isn't for them. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Good. Then he walked out, disappearing into the Chicago night. Illyra stood there for a long time, the rose still in her hand, the piano key pin cool against her chest. The next morning, she woke to an email from the rehab center. It was brief. Your brother's account has been fully covered for the next 6 months, including transportation and home therapy equipment. No further action needed. There was no name attached, just a reference number. She knew. She didn't call to thank him. She didn't need to. Some understandings don't require words. Instead, she went to the community arts center early. She decided to expand her class, add a second session for older kids, those who'd outgrown beginner lessons but couldn't afford private teachers. Rosa was thrilled. We'll clear out the storage room, she said. Turn it into a proper studio. They spent the day hauling boxes, painting walls a soft blue, and tuning the donated upright piano. By evening, the space smelled of fresh paint and possibility. That week, Illyra also met with a local nonprofit that supported artists from underrepresented backgrounds. They offered her a microgrant, not enough to live on, but enough to cover the first month's rent on a tiny storefront she'd been eyeing near the arts center. The space was small, just one room, a bathroom, and a window that faced a quiet street. But it had good light and solid floors. Most importantly, it had room for 2 pianos. She signed the lease on a rainy Thursday. Matteo helped her move in the following weekend. They carried in a second-hand keyboard, a folding table for sheet music, and a worn but comfortable armchair for waiting students. Illyra hung the piano key pin on the wall above the main piano like a talisman. On the door, she painted a simple sign in white letters. Voss Music Studio, lessons for everyone. No fancy logo. No prices listed, just an open door. Her first student arrived the next Monday, a shy boy named Leo whose mother worked double shifts at a laundromat. He'd never touched a real piano before. His hands hovered over the keys like they might burn him. It's okay, Illyra said, sitting beside him. The piano doesn't bite. He laughed nervously. She showed him how to find middle C, then C major, then a simple melody from a lullaby his grandmother used to sing. By the end of the lesson, he was smiling. Word spread quickly. Within a month, she had 12 regular students, ages 5 to 17. She charged what families could afford. Some paid in cash, some in homemade soup. One mother offered to mend Illyra's uniforms in exchange for lessons. Illyra accepted it all. This wasn't business. It was community. She still played at Laurent's on weekends, but now it felt different. She wasn't hiding. She was sharing. And the guests listened, not because she was a curiosity, but because her music carried something real. One night, Julian returned. He didn't sit at the bar this time. He took a small table near the piano, ordered tea instead of whiskey, and listened without looking away. After her set, he didn't approach her, but as he left, he slipped an envelope into the tip jar on the piano. Inside was a check, not to her, but made out to the Voss Music Studio, with a note, for new sheet music. Keep the door open. She used the money to buy beginner books, theory workbooks, and a metronome for the studio. She also started composing again, short pieces inspired by her students. One for Aisha, who loved rain, one for Leo, who missed his grandmother. She called them Lessons in Hope. Meanwhile, Julian began making quiet changes of his own. He redirected a portion of his company's community outreach budget to fund after-school arts programs in underserved neighborhoods. He didn't put his name on the donations, didn't issue press releases. He simply called the directors, said, "I'd like to support music education," and let them decide how to use the funds. His assistant was baffled. "Since when do you care about piano lessons?" Julian didn't answer, but he started attending school recitals, sitting in the back, never clapping too loudly, always leaving before anyone could thank him. Back at the studio, Elira received a letter from Juilliard. Not an invitation, but a quiet acknowledgement. A former professor had seen her recital video and written to say her interpretation of Chopin had redefined his understanding of the piece. It wasn't an offer to return. It didn't need to be. It was simply recognition from the very institution that had once felt like a closed door. She taped the letter to the studio wall, next to her students' drawings and recital photos. One evening, as she locked up the studio, Matteo pulled up on a second-hand bicycle, his first since the accident. "Thought I'd give wheels another try," he said, grinning. She hugged him. "Just promise me no stunts." "No stunts," he agreed. "But maybe a duet someday. I used to play recorder in elementary school." She laughed. "We'll start you on piano." Recorder's a hard sell. Life wasn't perfect. Some months the studio barely broke even. Some days Elira still worried about the future. But for the first time in years, she wasn't running. She was building, and Julian, he was learning to listen not just to music, but to the quiet stories unfolding all around him, in places he'd once walked past without seeing. Neither of them knew it yet, but their paths weren't done crossing. Because sometimes, healing doesn't come in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it comes in a covered therapy bill, a donated piano book, a silent nod across a room, small acts of repair, offered without expectation, received without shame. And in those small acts, something new begins to grow. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering that shimmered under the kitchen light. Elira almost missed it, buried beneath utility bills and a flyer for a neighborhood cleanup. But something about the weight of the paper made her pause. She opened it slowly, as if it might dissolve in her hands. It was an invitation to perform at the annual Harmony Gala, a high-profile charity event held at the city's historic Lyric Hall. The theme this year, Breaking Barriers, Building Hope. The cause, medical debt relief for families facing long-term recovery. The organizers had seen her recital, heard about her studio, and wanted her to close the evening with an original piece. Elira read the letter 3 times. Her first instinct was to say no. She wasn't a gala performer. She was a teacher, a sister, a woman who still checked her bank balance before buying groceries. But then she thought of Matteo's months of pain, the nights she'd lain awake calculating how to stretch a $20 bill into a week's meals. The faces of parents at her studio who whispered, "We'll pay next month," with shame in their eyes. This wasn't about her. It was about them. She said yes. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. She composed a new piece, simple in structure, deep in feeling, titled Second Chances. It began with a single questioning note, like someone stepping into the unknown. Then it grew, hesitant at first, then stronger, weaving in fragments of lullabies, street sounds, hospital beeps transformed into rhythm, and finally a rising melody that felt like sunlight after a long storm. She practiced it every night, refining each phrase until it carried not just music, but meaning. Matteo helped her pick out a dress, deep blue, modest, with sleeves that wouldn't slip while she played. "You look like you belong on that stage," he said, adjusting the collar. "I belong wherever I'm needed," she replied. The night of the gala, the city seemed to hold its breath. Rain threatened but never fell, leaving the streets glistening under soft amber lights. Lyric Hall glowed like a jewel, its marble steps, arched windows, and grand entrance buzzing with donors, doctors, and local leaders in evening wear. Elira arrived early, carrying her sheet music in a worn folder and wearing the piano key pin Aisha had given her. Backstage, she changed into her dress and sat quietly, hands resting in her lap. She didn't pace, didn't fidget, she just breathed. Then she saw him. Julian stood near the entrance to the main hall, not in a tuxedo but in a dark suit, no tie, looking more like someone who'd wandered in by accident than a guest of honor. He wasn't schmoozing, wasn't holding a champagne flute, just stood near the back wall, arms crossed, watching the room with quiet intensity. Their eyes met across the space. He gave a small nod. She returned it. No words. None were needed. The program began with speeches about medical bankruptcy, about families forced to choose between rent and recovery, about how one accident could unravel a life. Elira listened from the wings, her heart aching for every story told. Then came musical interludes, a string quartet, a young soprano, a jazz ensemble. Each performance was polished, professional, beautiful. But when Elira walked onto the stage, the room changed. She didn't stride. She didn't smile for the crowd. She simply walked to the grand piano, sat, and placed her hands on the keys. The hall fell silent, not out of politeness, but out of anticipation. She began. Second chances. Unfolded like a story without words. The opening notes were sparse, echoing the loneliness of hospital rooms and sleepless nights. Then a gentle rhythm emerged, like a heartbeat returning, steady and sure. Midway through, she wove in a fragment of the lullaby her mother used to sing, transformed into something both mournful and hopeful. The final section swelled, not with showy virtuosity, but with quiet triumph, as if to say, "We are still here. We are still trying." When the last note faded, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the room erupted, not just applause. People were on their feet. Some were crying. A doctor in the front row wiped his eyes with his program. Even the event organizers, usually composed, stood with hands over their hearts. Elira rose slowly. She didn't bow. She just looked out at the crowd, not at the wealthy donors, not at the cameras, but at the faces of the families seated in the back, invited as guests of honor, a mother holding her son's hand, a teenager in a wheelchair, an elderly couple who'd sold their home to pay for treatment. She played for them. Afterward, as guests mingled and champagne flowed, Julian approached her near the refreshment table. He held 2 glasses of sparkling water. "I didn't think music could do that," he said, handing her one. "Do what?" she asked. "Make someone feel seen," he said quietly. She took the glass. "It's not the music. It's the truth behind it," he nodded. "I've been thinking about what you said, about dignity, about earning your way." "And?" she prompted. "I've started a small fund," he said. "Not in my name. Anonymous. It covers co-pays and therapy costs for families referred by community clinics. No paperwork. No interviews. Just help." She looked at him, really looked. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something quieter. Humility, maybe, or simply the beginning of understanding. "That's good," she said. "Really good," he hesitated. "I'm not doing it to make up for that night." "I know," she said. "You're doing it because you finally see the people behind the roles." He exhaled, as if releasing a weight he'd carried for years. "It's strange," he said. "I spent my life building walls around my business, my reputation, myself. And it took a waitress playing Chopin to show me they were all illusions." Elira smiled faintly. "We're all more than our worst moment. Even you." He looked down, then back at her. "Thank you for not letting me stay the man I was." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the gala around them. Later that night, as Elira packed up her music, Rosa appeared with a group of kids from the arts center. Aisha, Leo, and 4 others, all dressed in their best clothes, eyes wide with excitement. "We came to see you," Aisha said, bouncing on her toes. "You were amazing," Leo added, voice full of awe. Elira knelt, pulling them into a group hug. "You're the reason I played," she said. "So you'd know that your dreams matter, no matter where you start." The next morning, life returned to its rhythm, but a new one. Elira opened the studio early. She'd decided to expand again, add weekend workshops, partner with local schools, even offer online lessons for kids in rural areas. The gala performance had brought donations, yes, but more importantly, It had brought belief. People believed in her mission, and that was worth more than money. Julian, meanwhile, began visiting the studio, not as a donor, but as a listener. He'd sit in the back during open rehearsals, never speaking, just watching kids discover the joy of making music. One afternoon, he asked Elira if he could sponsor a scholarship, full lessons for a year, awarded to a student with talent but no means. She agreed, but only if the selection was done by the students themselves. Let them choose who needs it most, she said. He agreed without hesitation. Months passed. Seasons turned. The studio grew, not in size but in heart. Elira hired a second teacher, a retired music professor who'd lost her job when her school cut arts funding. Together they built a space where no child was turned away, where mistakes were celebrated as steps forward, and where music wasn't a luxury, it was a lifeline. One spring afternoon, Elira sat at the piano with a new student, a shy 10-year-old named Noah, whose family had just moved to the city after losing their home in a fire. His hands trembled as he placed them on the keys. "It's okay," Elira said gently, just as she had with Leo months before. "The piano doesn't bite." He looked up at her, eyes wide. "Will I ever play like you?" She smiled. "You'll play like yourself, and that's even better." Outside, sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes in golden swirls. On the wall, the Juilliard letter hung beside children's drawings and a photo of Matteo walking without crutches. On the piano key pin gleamed, and in the back of the room, unnoticed by most, Julian sat quietly, listening, not as a man who once tried to humiliate a waitress, but as someone who'd learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to see true wealth. Elira had come to understand, wasn't measured in bank accounts or buildings or watches that cost more than a year's rent. It was measured in moments like this: a child's first scale, a brother's steady step, a stranger's quiet change of heart. It was in the courage to rise when the world expects you to stay down, and in the grace to offer a second chance, even to yourself.